Good morning. My name is Leighton Reed, and I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech. And this morning, I'm going to tell you about some work that I've done with several others, including Rebecca Montgomery, who's here at the meeting. The alternative title for this presentation is "When Life Gives You Lemons, Make Lemonade." So you don't have to look very far in the news to find information about how fires are changing the nature of tropical forests in Amazonia and in Indonesia. And the same is true for restored forests, which are also threatened by wildfires. An important task for restoration ecologists is to think about how the choices that we make in terms of where we plant trees or when we decide to do natural regeneration in different contexts influences the type of damage that fire might have on tree plantations. This is particularly true in Madagascar. Fire is one of a suite of complex problems that make it challenging to do restoration in Madagascar. A recent study found that 50% of all of the remaining forests in Madagascar have been within 1 kilometer of a fire during the past decade. And that's a major threat to the endemic biodiversity on Madagascar. This is an 80-million-year-old island that has more than 80% endemicity of animals and plants. There's also evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic has made this worse due to, especially at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when there were few people managing protected areas, fire frequency inside of protected areas increased by between 50 and 250%. So here's the lemons that life gave to a graduate student named Matt Hill a few years ago when he was doing his thesis in eastern Madagascar. Matt had planted 4,700 trees for an experiment that was designed to test some hypotheses about competition, but he didn't get the chance to test any of those hypotheses because after just a few short months, a fire raged through his study site and burned all of his trees right to the ground. And it was a really difficult, phone call, but his committee encouraged Matt to go out and measure the survivorship of all of these trees and try to make lemonade out of it. And that's what he did. So fires in eastern Madagascar are primarily fueled by a couple of different plant species that grow commonly in the agricultural matrix. And those are traveler's palm, Ravenala madagascariensis, and also a fern, Dicronopterus linearis, that has a pantropical distribution. This schematic shows from that 2016 study that Matt Hill was doing the intensity or heat production of the fire in a bunch of different plantings and the average mortality of seedlings, or the average survivorship, excuse me, of seedlings in different planting positions. So two things to take home here. One is that there's a tight correlation between the survivorship of tree seedlings and the intensity of the fire. It's a negative relationship. So down here in the lower part of this diagram, you can see the lowest survivorship and the most intense fires. And the second thing to take away is we noticed that fire intensity and tree seedling survival were both, fire intensity was maximized and tree seedling survival was minimized along the edges of these applied nucleation plantings. So based on these observations, we made a couple of hypotheses about how you might be able to design forest restoration to mitigate wildfire damage. And that was our central question. How does restoration strategy affect fire damage? Our first hypothesis is that larger tree plantings will be less damaged by fire. And our second hypothesis is that denser tree plantings will be less damaged by fire. The rationale for larger tree plantings is that if the trees that are at the greatest risk are the ones that are at the edge of a tree planting, the ones that are closest to that really highly flammable matrix of traveler's palm and Dicronopterus ferns, then larger tree plantings that have a lower edge to interior ratio should have proportionally lower damage from wildfires. Likewise, we expected that denser plantings would be less damaged by wildfire because if trees are planted more densely together, then there's less niche space that's available in between them for the rudderable flammable plants to persist. Another observation that we made in that 2016 fire is that fire damage was not consistent across species. Some species were much more resistant to fire damage and some were much more vulnerable. So for example, Insia bijuga, IB here, had about 18% survival, whereas wapaka, which is the species at the far right, had 0% survival. And so this led us to make one more hypothesis, which is that planting fire-resistant species reduces fire damage. So here's how we're making lemonade out of the wildfire risk in eastern Madagascar. We've designed a new restoration experiment that has been installed at about 30 sites since 2018. And this restoration experiment includes 4 treatments at every site within 25 by 25 meter blocks of agricultural land. The treatments are large sparse plantations, which are 25 by 25 meters and have 4.5 meter spacing in between the trees. Small sparse islands, which have the same density but are only 9 by 9 meters. Small dense islands, which have 1 by 1 meter spacing and are 9 by 9 meters. And what we call fire dense islands, which are 1 by 1 meter spacing and 9 by 9 meters. And the difference with the fire islands is that they use these native fire resistant or fire retardant species. This is not a factorial design. It's designed to test 3 basic hypotheses. So first, that larger plantings will be less damaged by wildfire. Second, that denser plantings will be less damaged by wildfire. And third, that planting fire resistant species will reduce wildfire damage. As I said, this experiment has been replicated many times across eastern Madagascar, particularly in the vicinity of Toamasina, a big port city. And in January 2021, 3 of these sites actually burned. They got burned by wildfires. One of those sites was burned because a fire escaped while a neighbor was trying to clear a farm field. And another one of those fires was an act of arson, not against the restoration site, but against a neighboring clove plantation, and the fire spread out onto the restoration site. Here's what one of those burn sites looks like. And you can see the rapid regeneration of Ravenella palm here. So based on the evidence that's present at this site, in the weeks after the fires, we were able to calculate fire intensity, that is the amount of heat production, fire severity, that is the amount of damage to plants, and then tree seedling survivorship or mortality. I'm only going to talk about fire intensity and tree seedling survivorship here because fire intensity and fire severity are very closely related. So the way that we measured fire intensity was using an index, a 7-point index, where we looked at evidence that was present in the field. So it was basically a 0 or a 1 for each one of these categories. Was the vegetation burned? Was the soil burned? Was the plastic tree tag melted? Was the wooden marker that the plastic tree tag was on scorched? Was the plastic tag cinder? Was the wooden marker cinder? And was the metal tag that was also attached to this post turned into cinder? Here's an example of some of the variation in the wooden posts after the fire. So it's pretty hot fires. For seedling survival, we scored that after several rain events. And the reason for that is because the way that many of these trees survive is by resprouting from their roots. And so it's not immediately apparent after the fire whether a tree has lived or died. Ultimately, we found that out of the 750 tree seedlings or so at these 3 sites, 82% of them died in the wildfires. The mortality was independent of tree size. These were plantings that were between 2 and 3 years old, but they were really variable across species, with some species having as little as about 47% mortality and others having 100% mortality. Mortality was strongly related to fire intensity. So here, fire intensity, that 7-point scale, is on the x-axis, and whether tree seedlings were alive or dead is on the y-axis. I added some jitter so that you can see the points here. Just for reference, 3 here is the level at which the plastic tag usually had melted, and by level 7 is where the aluminum tag had been turned into cinder. So by about level 3, most trees were dead. Let's talk for a moment about fire intensity as it relates to these 4 different plantings. I'm going to go through these results hypothesis by hypothesis. So we found, contrary to what we expected, lower fire intensity in smaller tree planting patches. We expected that fire intensity would be lower in larger tree planting patches. Consistent with our hypothesis, we found that fire intensity was lower in denser plantings compared to sparse plantings. But also contrary to our expectations, the fire resistant species that we planted tended to have a higher fire intensity, not a lower fire intensity. Where the rubber meets the road, though, is with tree mortality, and the results were a little bit different here. So the main result is that there was lower tree mortality in small, dense plantings compared to large, sparse plantings, and small, sparse plantings were intermediate. One reason why we might not have found an effect of planting size on mortality is that we did not find an effect of planting position on fire intensity or seedling mortality. That is, the trees that were on the buffer on the outside of those restoration plots did not burn hotter or have lower mortality or higher mortality than the trees that were in the middle. So our central question here was, how does restoration strategy affect fire damage? And essentially what we've found is that planting densely at a 1 meter separation reduced tree mortality by about 20% compared to planting at a much sparser density. And planting size and composition affected fire intensity, but not mortality. And what we found in terms of these two factors was not what we had expected. So why do we find things that we didn't expect? You know, these two sites, two of the three sites that burned were rockier than most of our sites in this area, and that might have influenced fire behavior. We also don't know the direction that the wind was blowing, and so it may be that the wind was blowing so that one of the plots was burning more hotly than some of the other plots. It could also be that we've got a relatively low sample size here. Fortunately, 2 more of our sites burned in early 2022, and so we've got data now on the intensity of that fire, but we're still waiting for data on tree mortality. So I haven't presented those data here, but our sample size is set to increase. Ultimately, if we can figure out how to restore forest in a way that mitigates wildfire damage, then that's going to help Madagascar be able to realize their commitment to restore 4 million hectares of degraded land, or about 7% of the total national territory of Madagascar, by 2030. A lot of this work was done by my partners on the ground, Green Again Madagascar, which is a nonprofit that's seeking to conserve the unique biodiversity of Madagascar and support traditional lifeways. We've got a variety of other research projects going on, including collaborative projects with local people focused on native plant propagation, assisted natural regeneration, tree planting maintenance, and local ecological knowledge, which suffuses through all of these different projects. And you can read more about this group at greenagainmadagascar.org. Finally, I want to thank the folks at Green Again, the Malagasy landowners, and the funders who made this work possible. And I also just want to highlight that in the Restoration Ecology Lab at Virginia Tech, I've got 2 new PhD positions that I'm trying to hire for. So if you know anyone who's interested in studying temperate woodland restoration and its effects on endangered orchids, or how to prevent invasive species colonization and stream restorations, please send me an email or let them know about this opportunity. Thank you very much.